I'm going to give you the worst advice I was ever given. I was in my 20s, and I was in a corporate job in the finance sector. My wife met me. Sorry, my girlfriend, as she was in those days, met me in this bar, and there were 8 men, all in blue suits, with a briefcase on the floor next to their right foot and a pint of Boddingtons in their hand, because we were in Manchester in those days. And she just said, "You so don't fit here," because it was the corporate cloning. And this takes me back to the worst advice I was given. Was a friend of ours who worked for a certain chocolate manufacturer in England, and he was doing very, very well in that organization through the branding and the marketing and everything else. And his advice to me was that I had to stop being flippant. I had to stop being a laugh, because nobody in the corporate world will ever take you seriously if you're always trying to have a joke.
My guest today is Mike Pagan. Mike, you're very welcome on the GYFT Show.
Thank you for having me, John. Looking forward to this.
You're most welcome. First question I have for you is, tell us, at what stage in your life did you find yourself? What relationship broke you to help you discover yourself?
Discovering myself, yeah. It's an interesting one. Just when you see relationships between parents, siblings, wife, children, all they all bring in different little messages. When I was younger, I wasn't a good student. I didn't have a close relationship with academia, so that meant I was always challenging. And you just see the relationships around that. I remember I built a relationship with my father once I'd finished school, because it was one of those environments where we got on, but we didn't know each other. But then it became a bit of a friendship, sort of, when suddenly I was then becoming a young adult and going through. And it had a lot of powerful impact on me, predominantly in a good way, which is always nice.
That's an interesting answer. So I can understand what you're saying there, that your parents probably had expectations of you in an academic sense, but perhaps you didn't fulfill those expectations, particularly of your father. And perhaps your father felt somewhat disappointed during your school years. And
there's parts of that, because he was an even worse student than me, to be fair. So it wasn't from academic prowess that the pressure was. It was more just I didn't find out until late in life that I was dyslexic, which I'm sure probably didn't help when I was a school kid. But back in the day, you just sort of got on with it, and you were just an annoying little what's-it at school. And I was at boarding school, so I wasn't in my parents' house for many years. So because you're away, you're just doing your own thing, and I was very independent. So it's knowing where those relationships kick in. I met my wife young. I was only 21 when I met her, and she still is the current wife. So that's always good.
So you had no problem in terms of finding a relationship and getting married. Well done to you. But I can understand your frustration with school, because you went to a public school and there was no effort put into identifying your dyslexia during your school years. If it had been discovered then, you would have got the help you required to progress more in an academic sense. So that's just...
Yeah. On reflection, I would have gone down different paths potentially, because you would have had more support in those areas which were the areas you probably enjoyed more, but you couldn't get there because... but it's that reality. I only did those tests because one of my daughters came through when she went off to uni, and she came back quite severely dyslexic. All the research and the reading I was doing so that I could support and help her, I was ticking, I do that. And that's the whole point in life. You're always learning. I'm 50 plus now, and that's when I found out that I'd always been there. I've written 4 books. I've done all sorts of other stuff. So it's not for a want of lack of capability. It's just you have to build that support around you that helps you to achieve those things. Otherwise, it becomes an ailment, and I don't believe in ailments.
So
you know what I mean.
Of course, yeah. And getting married at 21 or 22 years of age, did you find that you had to grow up pretty quickly?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Did I grow up quickly? I was always, in many ways, I was always mature for my years. But it was, I think the one thing that really did have an impact on me, I did one of those years traveling overseas as a young guy, and we did a lot of stupid stuff. No, we really did. But what it did was, partway through that, I was living in a bedsit in Sydney, in Australia, and I had there were 7 of us living in there. It was a bedsit, yeah. So we were all scattered everywhere, and it took us 2 months of living in Sydney before I got to the Opera House. And now it wasn't to go and see a show or anything like that. I didn't even go and walk around the outside of it because we were partying hard and being silly. And it's just sort of, hold on a second. There are gifts on this planet that are utterly gorgeous, whether they be man-made like the Sydney is, or things like Table Mountain or Edinburgh Castle, things like that. They've all got different historical and different stuff. But you've got to appreciate things like that. Otherwise, you're just a bit of an idiot. And I was at that stage. So that was on reflection. So that during my traveling time, I grew up a lot.
Man, sure, we all have to sow wild oats, and get out there and enjoy life and have a few beers. But I think, as you're saying there, Mike, it's a case of doing it in moderation. And wherever you are in the world, try and take the good out of life and to go out there and look at all these historical sites. I lived for a couple of years in London myself. I didn't always make much effort to visit various museums that are there, even today, that I wish I had gone to, of course. But that's another day's work, another story. But I'd love to go there again as a tourist and go to places like the National History Museum, the London Transport Museum. Fantastic places to go to. But when you're young, you don't think of these things. You're more interested in having a few beers with your friends and colleagues. Yeah,
it's knowing that balance of what do we do that reboots, that invigorates us, and just it's sowing the seed. There are people in my world that you've heard me talking about, the world of mental wealth and so on before. But in that, it is about having the good people around us that inspire creativity, that help us make better decisions than we can on our own, will give us honest, brutal advice where necessary, or reflect on what we're doing. And that is so powerful. But those are the relationships that enable us to be stronger and better and more potent than we are on our own. And those relationships will ebb and flow. I'm always talking about, my late mother-in-law had that wonderful phrase, and it's not her phrase because it's been out there for many years, but I only heard it, as in worked it out for the first time, and that was the whole thing of people are there for a reason, a season, or for life. And if you can count your friends on more than one hand, you're kidding yourself. Your best friends, and there were little nuggets like that where, I know there are certain people who have come into my life for a reason. There's been something to do with the sport, or there's been something to do with one of the children, or they're there for a season because it's just the school gate. But then once that's gone, then they move on. They're just friendships for that period of time. I was living in London, as you said, for 2 years. But in that time you were living in London, you will have had certain friendships, but they probably didn't last. Some of them didn't last the distance when you moved back to Ireland.
Of course.
Yeah. And that's because those friendships were for that season.
Of course, I agree with you there, because I have friends in school, of course, they're long in the past, friends of work, if you want to call them that, or colleagues, all forgotten about. You have to move on in life. And then, of course, you meet people in other trade associations, professional associations, where there's an opportunity to maybe to develop deeper friendship with people because you share interests and value with those people. That's kind of more the type of friendship you want for your life.
Just, you got me thinking about a statistic. I don't know the number, but what is the statistic of the number of people who meet their spouse at work? And I'm sure it's as high as all 40 or even 50%. Because obviously that's the environment you're in, and those relationships get built. And I'm sure through the COVID years that probably dropped off a bit because everybody was working remotely. But now we're in a hybrid world. Will that make a difference to the courting that goes on in the workplace?
Interesting one to think about. All right, yeah. And in terms of your own working relationships after leaving school, how did you transition into the working environment? Was it difficult for you, or did you kind of transition reasonably easily?
It's one of the challenges is always finding the right role models, that you sort of, be they colleagues, be they friends, be that how it works. And I'm going to give you the worst advice I was ever given. I was in my 20s, and I was in a corporate job in the finance sector, and my wife met me. Sorry, my girlfriend, as she was in those days, met me in this bar, and there were 8 men, all in blue suits, with a briefcase on the floor next to their right foot and a pint of Boddingtons in their hand, because we were in Manchester in those days, and she just said, "You so don't fit here," because it was the corporate cloning. And this takes me back to the worst advice I was given. Was a friend of ours who worked for a certain chocolate manufacturer in England, and he was doing very, very well in that organization through the branding and the marketing and everything else. And his advice to me was that I had to stop being flippant. I had to stop being a laugh, because nobody in the corporate world will ever take you seriously if you're always trying to have a joke. And I heard what he said there. I listened to it. And so I put my personality in a box. And I jokingly describe, I then became schizophrenic. So I had the work Mike and the out of work Mike. And the two never met for about 7 years. And it was really quite, on reflection, quite frightening, sort of how that one statement from an individual told me to just put my natural personality in a box, because nobody take you seriously. To actually know that was so bad, because it meant that I wasn't true to myself. I was doing jobs that I was having to just go through the motions and whatever, but it wasn't me. I wasn't able to be me. When I left the corporate world and I moved overseas for a number of years, then I opened up again. But it was just knowing what you know and what you don't know. Some of those relationships, not all advice is whilst it may well be well intended, isn't necessarily it certainly wasn't what I wanted or needed to hear at that time.
I understand what you're saying there, Mike, because when I went into the corporate world myself, I was a person who kind of, took life spontaneously. I keep my options open. And then I realized I was working with people who are very much in the now type people, and they want to make decisions here and now. And I struggled to cope with those people. So I had to almost become a people pleaser to try and build a relationship with those people. And it ended up that I wasn't able to identify my own purpose in life. And I struggled for some time in the corporate sector because I became that people pleaser who couldn't say no to anything and said yes to everything. And you end up, burning yourself out. You have no purpose in life. And all you're doing is allowing other people to use you for their benefit.
Yeah. And that doesn't work. And it's knowing how different people, and you look at a boardroom table, and you'll have one person that is so gung-ho, and this is behavioral traits and personality types and everything else. And there's others that need to sit and process, and there's others that don't speak up at all, because they just sort of they're listening, but that's not their style. And it's knowing that rich IQ and EQ and intelligence are around the table, everybody's view and skill set is so important to that environment. And it's nowadays it's knowing how to facilitate that so that everybody gets heard that needs to be heard, and that has a view. And it's also that just because somebody isn't verbose, loud and gobby doesn't make them any less valuable, because that's just the way they work. I mean, we've met through the joys of the platform and the speaking world, but that doesn't mean to say that just because you can stand up in front of 100 people or 1,000 people or whatever else, that you're some raging extrovert that needs to shout and be heard. No, that's a performance. And for so many in that community, in that industry, they are either ambiverts or true introverts. And there's a smaller percentage that are what I would refer to as the raging extrovert. And yeah, great fun to be around.
True. Yeah.
But it's not me.
Yeah. So what caused you to transition from the corporate world to move overseas?
That comes under the category of I always, when I first met my wife, I said, let's go and live overseas and have some time. And so I said, well, maybe we should get to know each other a little bit first. And my raison d'etre was I never wanted to wake up at the age of 50 saying what if or if only. And so we engineered it. It took time to get it all sorted. And I was then accused of being the best salesman in the world, because the story goes, wife, baby, rucksack, no car, no job, no house, moving to the other side of the planet, moving back to the UK 3 years later, same wife, 2 kids, small container ship, not quite, but it felt like it, set up a business in a country I hadn't lived in for 3 years, in a location I'd never lived in before in my life, without a proven track record, no client database, and just a goodwill to go for it. And it took me 6 months to write my first invoice. And that was 20 plus years ago now. And I'm still in that industry, and it's evolved and changed directions and so on. But the time I had overseas was very powerful, to the point that I've got one of my children is attending university in Australia nowadays. He's just starting. And then one has just been traveling over there, and another one is at university over here. So it's quite interesting how the world shrinks.
Fair play to you. And I think probably what happened was you matured tremendously as a professional person in your own right during those 3 years abroad. And then when you came back to the UK, you had a more, greater sense of urgency about you. You knew what your purpose in life was, and you decided to go down the self-employment route. So over the past 20 odd years in the self-employment world, I should say, how has that journey been for you?
It's yo-yoed as all industries and all businesses have. I've had some very positive years. I've had some very lean years. I've had some really good projects and partners, and I've made some really bad errors as well. So I think that is the nature. But the beauty of the errors, and I'm not going to get cliched here, but the beauty of the errors, after time, I have learned from them. So whilst they may be painful, and I did some work in the property investment world, and I was successful in some and horrendously unsuccessful in others, which cost a lot, which nearly sent us over the edge, things like that. But I was embarrassed and annoyed with myself for many years at that time. But that was because the partners that I was aligning with, that I thought were brilliant, weren't as good. I made errors myself. It's sort of taking independent advice, legal advice, all these other things that, in hindsight, you're thinking, why didn't you? Well, you get caught up in the environment. But you learn from it, and where I've made mistakes has been when I haven't had good support around me. That's been the greatest learning, which has led me into the mental wealth world of building the right support around individuals and companies to deal with that isolation, to deal with the fact that when we have good people around us, we make braver decisions. And when we make braver decisions, even if they don't come out as we wanted, if they fail, then we'll bounce back more effectively. Or if they succeed, then we'll carry on that path and create other opportunities. And it's a fascinating journey, and a lot of it stemmed from the work I did with professional elite men and women in the sports world, transitioning to their career after sport. And that really opened my eyes to that guillotine effect of, yesterday there were 35 people keeping you on the pitch or in the pool or on the park or whatever it was, and the guillotine's down, and those are no longer fit for purpose. So who is in your support network? Who's helping you going forward? And who are you as an individual? Well, we all transition, be that from school to sixth form college to university or apprenticeships to first job to second job to first house to first partner, first spouse, and so on. Every 2-3 years, we are evolving and transitioning at a different point. And that means there are certain people that are no longer going to be fit for purpose for the next version. That doesn't mean to say we can't be friends with them anymore, but they're not going to, we need the next version of those. And that's that evolution of constantly doing that, and which I am constantly evolving. And you think back now to sort of before COVID, to now in the years after COVID, there are people that you've moved on from during that time. There are people that you've now got the 3.0 because the 2.0 is not fit for purpose anymore. And that's just a 3-year window. But we do that throughout our lives. It's just that's a very acute 3-year window because of all the pain and challenge that went with it. But now, okay, there's another 3-year window that started at the moment. And that will evolve.
Of course. You used a very important word there a couple of minutes ago that I wanted to talk about further, which is support. And only the other day, I was having a chat with David Heiner, and he was talking about the need, say, for professional speakers, of which we're both in that profession, to have support and accountability groups around you. And the smaller those groups are, the more effective they are, apparently, because people become much closer. They start bouncing ideas off each other. They often start holding each other accountable for taking action. So I think the whole area of support and accountability is really important for any self-employed individual.
There's an extra step I add into this bit, and people get confused between support, having support, and thinking that that's covered. But actually, there's levels of support, because there's a friendship circle. Now, that friendship circle could be at the school gate, at the golf club, at the breakfast club, whatever it is that we as individuals do. But that's a friendship circle. They're there saying, "Go on in, John. Yeah, you're a nice guy. Go on in, Mike. You're a good guy. Yeah, go on," and so on. But the intensive version then is the masterminding environment, the peer support, where people are empowered to call you out on the foolish ideas that you're coming up with, to call you out on the self-sabotage activities that you do use that you will prevent you from being as awesome as you are, and then hold you accountable clearly to what you say you're going to do. I make a serious separation between the difference of a friendship circle and a mastermind group, where that is empowered, brutal where necessary, but honest support that means that we are not isolated, that means we've got great people asking better questions of us, that means there are times when I'm in the hot seat and I'm getting a grilling, and then it flips around to I'm grilling the other person in the hot seat, but I know I'm being a hypocrite because I'm saying that she should be doing X, Y, and Z, and I don't do any of it myself. And that sort of level of intense accountability, so that the next time we meet, even if you do your actions at 2 a.m. in the morning before attending, those actions are completed. And that, so that, as I say, levels of support from the intense, powerful, but just so important, for whether you're in an executive in the corporate world, C-suite executive, senior manager, middle manager, whatever, or you're a solopreneur, freelance, independent, having that level of powerful support and accountability is such a strong part of your armory, however you want to dress it up.
I concur with that. Well done. Looking back at your past, what circumstances would you consider as character building blocks that shaped you to the person you've become today?
Uh, Two sides of that. One would be the failure in some of the property investing that I did, where I, because the pain and the discomfort and the ugly I learned through that made a big difference. Then the flip side of that, from positive, and this is part of the work I do looking after me and how that goes. And I've always been a very active person. I didn't make it to the elite professional level of rugby, but I was in the level below. Something to do with not being big enough or good enough. Can't think how they got that idea. Yeah. But I put it this way: I know that I got as high as I could, so there's no stone unturned. But through that journey of being an active person, I'm not an ultra adventurer that does extreme Arctic things. But yes, I am a weekend warrior. I do challenges, and one of the things I've learned through things like my open water swimming. I was part of a relay team that swam the Channel several years ago. I've done all sorts of different long swims, endurance all over the place, but not to the point of doing solos across all the straits and that. So I'm the level below that. But what I that educated me was that I love active mindfulness or active meditation. I've always said I couldn't do it because I never sit still for long enough. But in the real world, actually, what I was doing when I'm doing these activities, I find flow, and then at the end of that activity, I've got clarity, I've got energy, I've got excitement. And for me, that's one of that really powerful learnings for me through the life. It's just embracing the weirdness that I enjoy, but accepting that I'm getting benefits out of that. Obviously, I'm getting physical benefits from those activities, but I'm also getting huge mental benefits from those because it just gives me that reboot, that press, that source. Tonight, at the end of today, I will be heading to a lake locally where I volunteer occasionally, and it's perfect setup. And I will get in there and I will just splash around with about 100 other swimmers. And it's not about competing, it's not about racing, it's just about having some downtime, switch off, reboot, and feel better for it afterwards. And I will.
Good man. I think that's a very good answer. You have to take life seriously at times, but there's times you have to get out of the house and blow some steam off. You have to look after your own mental wealth and health and well-being. And I think physical exercise in any shape or form is really good in that sense. Yeah, I used to like running, but unfortunately, I've had to give it up there very recently because of problems with my knees. So we're going to have to find some other sport to to participate in, to to keep the energy up, to keep myself in a good mental and physical state. And just talking about
Absolutely.
rugby there.
And for me, I've got rugby knees. So I know running is not my favorite sport, which is why I fully embrace the swimming side of things. And to be fair, my transition from rugby went to water polo because I still needed my violence, but I just didn't want my legs bent in the wrong direction. Which worked. So it's knowing. I mean, the other one is obviously things like cycling. Yeah, you don't have the impact on the knees then, but it's finding the things that work. And let's be fair, for people watching it, activity, fitness, and so on isn't for everybody. Not everybody loves it, but it's finding that the equivalent. I mean, there are many people who love gardening. I'm not one of them, but that is so cathartic. But then on the same vein as that, one of my adult daughters nowadays has taken up painting by numbers because it's just, she can do that. She's not a perfect artist, so it's helped her. But when she's doing it, just enables her just switch off and not have a screen. There's statistics out there that people spend 10 to 14 hours a day in front of a screen, whether that be a monitor, whether it be a telephone or a TV or whatever it is, 10 to 14 hours a day. And you wonder why our eyesight is so bad. Yeah. Well, but let's find those other things. And if it from doing jigsaw puzzles and Scrabbles and painting by numbers through to physical activity, through to whittling in the garden, whatever, we need these things that just enable us to switch off and become present. That is so important.
A couple more questions before we finish up here, Mike. And the first question is, you talked about the fact that your relationship with your father wasn't particularly strong during your school-going years, and it improved afterwards. What's been the relationship between yourself and your own children over the years? What's that been like?
Interesting one. Good question. One of my daughters at the beginning of this year, doing a placement year with her university, went away on a business trip with a work colleague who was a father of four and was working full on in the corporate world. He had a terrible relationship with his wife. He had a terrible relationship with all of his children. It was sort of, and my daughter rang me and left me this little message just to say thank you. Said, because I now understand what you stepped away from when you went on independent and the work you did, because that enabled you to build a very powerful, strong relationship with all of your children. And for that was a young lady at the age of 22 years old who got that insight as a result of what was going on there. And what to me, it wasn't a sacrifice, but the description is, I wanted a close relationship with my children, and all of them I do have, even if they're overseas, because the joys of WhatsApp and whatever else nowadays, we can be on video calls on a regular basis and chatting. So it doesn't have the distance. When we lived overseas, it was still on the dial-up, and you couldn't video conferencing. No, that's not happening. And that was just too stilted. This, yeah, very different. So that was a purposeful intention of mine, was to have a strong relationship with them. I think my wife and I have been successful there because despite or in spite of their parenting, they're very nice people.
Hold on. And one last question for you. Name one relationship you'd like to have again, given another chance, and what would you do better this time?
Relationship with one person. Interesting. I was trying to just think of other than just the obvious family one. My sister and I, we're not close, but there's reasons behind that. We get on, but it's duty rather than other areas like that. I suppose the one would be only because I never knew him, because I was only 4 when he passed, and that was my grandfather on my mother's side. So I had a great relationship with other grandfather, but I was sort of obviously young. And my mother-in-law, but she passed early. I'd love to spend more time with her, but Quentin Moore, I really never knew him. He was a scientist in Glasgow, and he was the first to do many things. But I don't know him at all. I'd love to sort of sit him down in an interview like this and find out who he was and how it worked and what pushed his buttons, and just all of those elements behind it. Yeah, he's somebody that I would have loved to have known, but don't.
So interesting answer, because somewhat similar myself. I have great memories of my maternal grandfather, but I've got no memory of my paternal grandfather. He died when I was only 4 years of age, similar to what happened to yourself there and your grandfather. So I got no memory of my paternal grandfather. But overall, this has been a very interesting conversation today, Mike. So thank you for your time. And what I've gleaned from this conversation is, firstly, just because a person mightn't have a healthy relationship with one of their parents when they're growing up themselves, there's no reason that you can't have healthy relationships with your children when they're growing up and going to university and school and moving out from the family home. Secondly, I think it's so important, no matter how busy you are in life, no matter how busy your job is, no matter how much pressure you're under, you have to take time out and look after your own mental well-being and health, and get out of the house, get involved in some sporting activity, or else some leisure like painting or gardening, because we all need that peace of mind. And thirdly,
Definitely.
we talked about the corporate boardroom today, where the extroverts love to talk and the introverts are kind of forced to listen and they find it hard to participate. It's so important to develop your active listening skills in one hand, but also it's important to find your voice and not be afraid to speak up for yourself, or if you think something is wrong, to say so. So on that note, I'll bring today's conversation to a close. Thank you for your time, Mike.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
My dad I adored. We were thick as thieves. He was a docker, but he taught me that wealth is a mindset. I never got the impression from him that money was an issue. Dad, can we go on holiday? Yeah, we'll find a way. And that holiday might have been going to my aunt's house because she was on holiday and her house was not that far from the sea, so we'll go and stay there while she's on holiday. We had a holiday. All my peers were going abroad at that point, but we still had a holiday. My mum was very practical, very strong-willed, very roll your sleeves up and get on with it. Deal with it yourself. Don't ask anyone for help. For goodness sake, get on with it. So she taught me the ethic of hard work. And my dad taught me this abundant mindset, which I still have today. I've had to override my mum's teaching because sometimes you have to ask for help. It's not a bad thing.